So are you ready to start crocheting? I know I am ready for you guys to finally start looking at patterns and knowing what you're looking for. And I think at this point, even if we didn't go over working through this pattern together, you would probably be able to figure out patterns because we've kind of already gone over a lot of the abbreviations as we've gone along. And I just think that you would be confident enough to start reading a pattern yourself. But again, I know some people like to have their hands held through new things, so we're gonna walk through this pattern completely together. So we already went through the getting started portion, which is up here, that's not in the camera. Since I've had you guys print out your patterns or have your patterns in front of you, I'm not going to read through each pattern with the camera on the pattern because I don't want to have to zoom in and zoom out and get my hands. So I'm going to set the camera up to just get my hands, and I'm going to read the pattern as I go, and you can read along as well. That way I just don't have to keep messing with my camera while I'm doing this. So you should have your H hook and your size for yarn. And now let's look at our pattern where the note section is, because there's a note there that I want to talk about a little bit. The first note just talks about this is created for crochet school and there's going to be video tutorials, which we're working on now. And then the second part of the note says, this piece requires a small area to be worked in a different section of yarn. You can either make a small ball of yarn from the one you're working with, or you can simply find another end of yarn from the ball you are working with for these few stitches. So that means every skein of yarn, if you're using a center pull skein or a center pull ball yourself, you're pulling the yarn from the center of the skein. But what about the end of the yarn at, like, on the side? So here's the other end of this yarn. So if we're working from this center pull area, and we need to use a different section of yarn but not cut this yarn, which is what we're going to do in this pattern, you can start working from the outside side of the ball. You can start working from the outside of the ball, and then you don't have to cut this yarn to reuse it. Now, if you're working from a ball that you balled up yourself that only has the outside, because I know some of you said you preferred to work with just a ball of yarn, you can just make another ball of yarn from the ball of yarn you're working on that's not very big, maybe like 2 inches in diameter, 2.5, because you're not using it for very many stitches, about 30 stitches total. And that's just so we can do our thumb area. Like I said, I prefer to use the outside of the skein I'm working with and just leave the inside working, but you can always make another ball of yarn for this. That's why I warned you about that ahead of time in the notes section. The stitch guide says DC and BLO, and that means make every double crochet stitch in the back loop of each stitch. That's just from what we've learned with the texture lessons. And so we're just going to do all of our stitches in the back loop of every row. So let's start on the left wrist warmer. Now, I did write a pattern for the left wrist warmer and the right wrist warmer. You could essentially make 2 left wrist warmers, but when you do that, the seam for the left one's going to be on the inside of your hand, which is how I made the pattern. And if you didn't make the right wrist warmer, the seam would be on this side of your hand and you could see it. Now, you can't see it very well, and I think really you'd be the only one that would notice there was a difference, but for the sake of making sure they're even with each other, I went ahead and made the seam on the inside of your palm for each wrist warmer. So you're gonna have a seam right here and right here on each one. That's why I did a left hand wrist warmer and a right hand wrist warmer. So the first instructions are to make your foundation chain, and so you're going to chain 32 stitches. That means if we're using double crochet and the double crochet's turning chain is 3 stitches, then that means we're going to be using 30 stitches throughout the whole piece. That's why you're doing 32 stitches. And it says make sure your foundation chain is not tight. Go up a hook size if you need to. If you have a tendency to make tight foundation chains, you definitely want to go up a hook size just for your foundation chain, because when we seam these pieces together, we're seaming foundation chain to the top of our finished row on this side, so it's going to be a tube. And if your foundation chain is too big or too small, it's not going to fit the top of this row. So you just want to make sure your foundation chain is nice and even and not super tight or super loose, because you want it to fit up nicely with this other side of the piece. So go ahead and make your chain of 32 stitches, and I will mine, and then I'll meet you back. So I have my foundation chain of 32 stitches, and now it says DC in the side of the 4th chain from the hook. So that means we're going to double crochet in the 4th chain from the hook. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's just making our turning chain there. And we're going to DC in the side of the chain, and that's because we want this bottom loop of the V here to be the bottom of our piece. So we're just going to stitch into the side of the chain for all of these double crochets here. So there's the first one, and then it says continue across remaining 28 stitches, making double crochets in the side of the foundation chain. So our turning chain counts as 1, and this one counts as 2, so we're going to do 28 more, and then after that it has 30 stitches in parentheses there. And the 30 stitches basically is telling you how many stitches you need to have at the end of the row. Not all pattern designers do this, but a lot do. Some people only do it whenever there's a change in stitches. And some people don't use it at all, so you have to count your own stitches. But most of the time really good pattern designers do that because they want you to be on track. So go ahead and double crochet in the side of all of your foundation chain, and then count your stitches to make sure you have 30 stitches at the end of the row, and I'll meet you back. I've done all of my double crochets into the chain, and you really do want to stitch into the side of the chain for this one. You just want this one loop at the bottom to finish off your piece. So now we're going to row 2, and it says chain 3 and turn. So chain 3 and turn, and then double crochet in back loop only across 29 stitches. So this was our 30th stitch, and then we'll just go all the way across. So we're just going to double crochet in the back loop of the next stitch. So remember, this stitch doesn't count, so we're going into, let's look at the V's over here. So this stitch here doesn't count, which is this V, so we're going to stitch into the back loop of this V here, which is this stitch right here. And then just double crochet in the back loop across the piece, and make sure you have 30 stitches at the end. And I'll meet you back at the end to go into this turning chain here. So I'm at this last turning chain stitch here that I need to stitch into, and for this one we are going to stitch into the back 2 parts of the turning chain. So we only want this front loop. So if we're looking at the top of the turning chain, so we can see the V's, we're just going to stitch to where this front loop is in front. So what I like to do is just go underneath the front loop, but we're not going to stitch into that. We're going to pop it back underneath the turning chain. So really we're stitching into these 2 back loops, but it's just easier to get the hook in if you stick it under the front loop and then pull it through. So see how that popped up this stitch right here, and that makes it look like the top of the rest of the stitches. So that's just how you want to do all the turning chains whenever you stitch into the turning chain, is to just go into the front loop and then put the needle underneath this loop down here, so you're going into the back 2 loops. And I'll show you that one more time before we finish. This is the end of row 2, and you should have 30 stitches like it says. And the next section says rows 3 through 9. Repeat step 2, so we're just going to repeat what we just did 7 times until you have 9 rows complete. We're just going to do the same thing we just did 7 times, so we have 9 rows in all. And you should have 30 stitches at the end of your last row. So I'm going to go back to this turning chain here and show you that turning chain one more time, and then I'll let you do the rest of it yourself. Okay, so we're back in our turning chain for the 3rd row, and remember you kind of have to flip the turning chain over to see the V's of it. So there we have it, and you're going to go through the front part of the V, push the needle through, and then make your double crochet over the top of that, the back 2 sides, and that just makes this row look good. It's not written into the pattern to do this because most people know where to put the hook in the turning chain for the rows like this. And you can really do it however you want. I just find that this is the best way. So this is my little tip to make it look like mine, is to go into the back two sides of the turning chain and leave that front loop to match up with the rest of these. So go ahead and do rows 4 through 9. You should have 9 rows completed, and you should still have 30 stitches at your last row, and then I'll meet you for row 10A. So now you should have this rectangle here. I should say, if you think that this pattern is not going to fit your wrists or your hands, it's made so it stretches out over your hand and then fits your wrist. But I do have small wrists, so if you have bigger wrists and feel like it's cutting off circulation or anything like that, this is where you can add or take away if you're trying to make this for a child or something. You do have to add or take away rows by 2. So this is where you would add 2 rows if you wanted to add 2 rows to make it bigger, or you would not do these last 2 rows, rows 8 and 9. You wouldn't do those 2 rows if you wanted to make it smaller. And if you were making this for a child, you'd probably want to make it a little bit shorter too, just depending on if they want to cover their whole half of their arm or not. That's kind of how you would adjust this pattern if you would want to adjust it. Most of the time that's not written into patterns because most pattern designers just give you the facts of how to make exactly what they made. But I'm just showing you that if you have a pattern that allows, like this one would easily allow for you to change it a bit. So you can always change patterns if you want. You don't have to do exactly what's written. In fact, in all my years of reading patterns, I rarely do exactly what is written because there's certain things that I don't like and certain things that I do. So I'll just take and change stuff as I want to, and that's perfectly fine. So again, if you want this tighter, don't do 2 rows. If you want it bigger, add 2 more rows to it. Now we're going into row 10A, and it says chain 3 and turn, and then DC in back loop only for 21 stitches, leaving the remaining stitches unworked. So you're just going to make your turning chain and then double crochet in the back loop only for 21 stitches, and you'll have 22 stitches total counting the turning chain. And then the next one says chain 3 and turn, double crochet in back loop only for 21 stitches, and pull up your loop so the last stitch doesn't come undone. And then do not finish off or cut. So what you're going to do is you're going to stitch 22 stitches and then stitch back to the side 22 stitches, and then you're going to pull up your loop like this, and then we'll start on the next row, which is row 10B, which will be over here. So I'm going to do my 2 rows of 22 stitches and I'll be back. Now your piece should look like this. You have like a little rectangle cut out right here, and then your 2 rows of 22 stitches. I went ahead and pulled my loop up. That's just going to secure this stitch until we get back to it to make sure that it doesn't come out. Now we need to take the other piece of yarn from the outside of the skein or the other ball that you've made, and we're going to turn the piece over like the directions for row 10B say, and just kind of pull out some yarn to get this out of the way. Now I'm taking my other end, and it says attach the other end of your ball of yarn to the back loop of the 24th stitch from row 10A. So this is 10A right here, and that was 22 stitches. So we're basically going to skip a stitch and then stitch into the back of the next stitch. So we're just skipping 23 and stitching into 24. And so I'm just going to connect my yarn, pull it through, and then wrap over. And now we're going to chain 3 and then double crochet in the back loop of the next 6 stitches. And I'm going to go over this end for 1 stitch, and then I'll weave the rest in later. Move that to the back. And now finish my last 5 stitches here. For the last one, we're going to go down through the side of the stitch. And then for 11B, we're going to chain 3 and then turn, and then double crochet in the back loops of the next 6 stitches. So we're just basically going to finish off this little rectangle here. And then do the last one. Now we need to connect this side to this side. So we have our thumb hole. And so what we're going to do is it says to make a chain 1 to replace the stitch that we skipped on 10B. And then we're going to cut the yarn. You don't have to leave a very long, maybe like a 5-inch tail. And then it says to attach the other side with an invisible join. So remember to do the invisible join, you just pull the stitch. And since this is a chain, make sure you don't pull too tight and make that chain close up. Let's thread our yarn needle. And we're going to go under the 2 V's of this stitch, not the turning chain. And then pull it through. And then go down through the top of the middle of the V's of the chain. So that's going to give us a finished edge here that will be easy to stitch into later. I'm just going to weave this down a little bit just to get it out of the way, and then I'll weave the rest in later once our ends are secure. So for row 12, we're just going to go back to the loop we left at the end over here. So this loop, and put our hook back on the loop. Remember, go from the way you're working out, then tighten it up around the shank. And then it just says to chain 3 and turn, and then double crochet in the back loop for 20 stitches. So basically we're going over to where we did that thumb join. And really this row is just a whole bunch of stitching into the back loop all the way across. But once you get to this thumb hole, there's a little bit of a trick that you have to do to make it look right. And it's written into the pattern, but I want to show you what it looks like just so you can get a good look at it. So here we are, we've done 20 stitches, and now we need to stitch into this stitch right here. This is our turning chain. This is our turning chain, and then this is the top of that invisible join that we did. So we're going to stitch into the top of the invisible join, but we're also going to come down here and pick up the back of the turning chain just to secure the turning chain to this this stitch here. So now when we do our stitch into those 2 stitches below, it'll look right. And our chain here, or our join there has gotten a little loose, but it's okay. So that's how that is supposed to look. It's supposed to look like that on the back, and then on the front you have the stitches, because you want this bump in the front to make that look right. Now we just need to stitch into this chain stitch right here, and this may be a little bit difficult to see if you've pulled your chain stitch tight, but just stitch into the back loop of the chain stitch that you made to make our thumb hole. So we're looking like that right now. And then just go ahead and double crochet in the back loop of the next 7 stitches. Three, 4, 5, 6, oops, dropped it, 6, and then 7, we're going to go into the side of the turning chain. So now we have our thumb hole. That's where your thumb will go whenever you're wearing the wrist warmer. Now the rest of the instructions are really easy. It's just row 13 and 14. So you're going to do 2 more rows of double crochet in the back loop, and then I'll meet you back at the end and we'll talk about what to do next. Now that we're at the end of our row, we're just going to make our one little chain stitch to finish off the piece, and then we're going to cut our yarn at about 20 inches or so long. You want a pretty long tail on this because we're going to use it to seam with, and then pull this all the way through that chain stitch, and that's going to finish our piece and give us something to seam up the ends with. And now you just need to weave in all the ends except for this really long one. So you have the 2 in your thumb hole area and then the one down here. And the finished edge with the V's at the top that you can see is actually the right side of the piece. And you can tell that by putting your thumb in to the piece and trying to wrap it around, and you can see that this is going to be our front. So we're going to weave in the ends on the back side. So weave them all into this side, and then don't weave in this end, and we will seam this together whenever we get to, not the next lesson, but the lesson after next, when we talk about seaming and finishing off pieces, because I want to save this for the seaming lesson. So go ahead and weave in all your ends on this piece, and then we're going to make your right wrist warmer by yourself. I'm not going to make it with you. It's really easy. It's just like this one, except you start on the short side and make the 2 rows and then start your thumb hole and then do the long rows all together. So go ahead and make your wrist warmers. If you have any problems, just go ahead and leave a comment in the comment box, or you can email me, but the comments do email me. And then I'll email you back and let you know if I can help you if you have an issue with this. I really have faith that you guys can do it because it's a pretty easy pattern and you know everything you need to know to do it. So good luck, and I'll see you next time.